Hi everyone, welcome to today's ecology class. For today I prepared to talk about two phenomena really present in science of ecology. It's ecological pyramids and ecological niches. My name is Divna, so let's start. Firstly, we'll talk about ecological pyramids. So, ecological pyramids, also called trophic pyramids or food pyramids among other names, is a graphical representation designed to show the biomass or bioproductivity or energy flow at each trophic level in a given ecosystem. So this is how it looks like. Ecological pyramids are basically a quantitative way to represent the relationship between organisms in a given ecosystem, and it's built up from bars which are stacked above one another. Basically, each level of pyramid is representing one trophic level, and then these relationships of these bars stacked on piled up on one on another, they can be shown via different variables and measurements. So in general, each trophic level is represented via one level of pyramid, but actually they can be stacked in different ways depending on what they are representing. Considering this, ecopyramids can be upright or converted or bell shaped, and what they can represent is the energy flow through the ecosystem, biomass as a reproductivity of an ecosystem, or a number of organisms per trophic level in a given ecosystem. So firstly, as when production is considered in terms of energy, the pyramid indicates not only the amount of energy flow at each level, but actually more importantly the actual role of various organisms that it plays in the transfer of energy. And then the energy pyramid illustrates how much energy is needed as it flows upwards to support the next and higher trophic level. So this is the story of energy trophic level. Next to energy pyramid, it can also be a number ecological pyramid, and it's generated by counting all organisms each one by one in a certain area or ecosystem. It can be in a standard upright way, but it also can be partly upright or inverted, and the shape of it varies with the ecosystem that needs to be presented. And the last one is a biomass ecological pyramid, and it's representing the amount of a biomass per trophic level, so per level of a pyramid. Depending on the shape, can be upright or inverted, and it also gradually decreases in the biomass from producers towards the top. This is how they look like. So the energy pyramids are always sloping because less energy is transferred from one level to the next higher one, all the way till the top. And in case such as in open water communities, the producers have less bulk than consumers, but the energy they store and pass on must be greater than of the next level, because there's always a part of energy, as we learned before, is lost in heat and all the other processes of metabolism and so on. So the energy transfer to the next trophic level is always in the less amount than on the previous level of a pyramid. Next one is the ecopyramids representing the numbers, and we can say it's a graphical relationship between the producers and various levels of consumers, but based on their population. So the number of specimens of a certain population of a certain organisms, and they are representing a level of a pyramid. So in most cases it's erected because the top is the tertiary consumers are the least in numbers, because they are usually biggest in mass and the amount of energy they are requiring for survival. On the other hand, the producers are usually bigger in number but smaller in body mass and the energy re required for survival. So in the here see here algae or bacteria, which would be the primary producers, bigger in number but less in biomass. And when we go upwards to the pyramid, the tertiary consumers are bigger as organisms, and of course less in numbers. This would be a great grassland and a pond example of an upright pyramid. But here you have a example of an inverted pyramid. When this would be any wood ecosystem, which you have a producer as for example oak tree, which is really big in mass and smaller in number than the hyperparasites, which can parasite on a parasite. That's why they're called hyperparasites. So the regular parasites are parasiting on birds, and they have their own parasites, which are called hyperparasites. They're the smallest ones in the food chain and the biggest in number, which obviously is going directly. And then the last option is to be bell-shaped, and this would be also a wood ecosystem, but only with 3 levels of a pyramid. So we have a producer, as we said, for example, the oak tree, the big one, and this is the herbivore birds, but then they are eaten by the carnivore, which would be here the secondary consumers, but actually the top predator, which is the biggest but the last in numbers, or at least less than its prey, but in numbers similar to the producer in this option. And then after number pyramid, there is a biomass ecological pyramid, and they, as we said, can be upright or inverted. The biomass pyramid is basically erected in terrestrial and inverted in aquatic ecosystem, because body mass of terrestrial food chain decreases as we go up in the food chain. So producers have higher biomass and tertiary consumers have less biomass. And then biomass increases as we go up in the aquatic food chain, because producers have less biomass but tertiary consumers have larger biomass. So this is how it looks like. Producers have higher biomass in a grassland ecosystem, whereas top predators are less in biomass, where on the other hand in aquatic ecosystems, producers as here would be, for example, photosynthetic microorganisms, bacteria or any other type. So their biomass is less than the top predator here, carnivores, which are much bigger in a biomass than the beginning of a food chain or a food pyramid, represented here in microorganisms. Now we're going to talk about other phenomena I mentioned in the beginning. It's an ecological niche. And here a niche is basically a term that is describing the relational position of a species or population in an ecosystem. This responds to the abundance of its resources and enemies. So on one hand, ecological pyramid is a state of situation, while ecological niche is something that the organism on its own can influence, and something where what is actually has its dynamics, it's movable, and among other things, organisms with their behavior can adapt their niche to their living situation. So this is basically evolutionary adaptation is ecological niche. It's also a role and a position of a species has in its environment and how it meets its needs for food and shelter and so on. so how it will survive and how it reproduce. And then a species niche includes all of its interactions with the biotic and abiotic factors of its environment. So as I said, it's a evolutionary response of an organism. So because it's as complex as I mentioned now, it's the idea of niche, there are different disagreements on what niche, different disagreements of what niche is representing. So its holistic approach and more basic ones. So there are a few types of niches, and as you can see, so food and place and behavioral niche and so on. But the most accepted ones are fundamental niche and realized niche. So the fundamental niche of a species includes the total range of environmental conditions that are suitable for existence without the influence of interspecific competition and predation from other species. On the other hand, the realized niche describes that part of the fundamental niche actually occupied the species. On the matter of the environment, in the concept of niche, we can speak of a niche of an individual, a populational, or a species niche. So the difference between an organism's environment and its niche is that the later concept includes the organism's ability at exploiting its environment and involves the ways in which an organism actually interfaces. So on a first glance, niche can be confused with the environment of an animal. For example, animal, so where it actually lives. But niche is not that. Niche is much more than that. The idea of niche is how an organism is interacting with its environment, biotic and abiotic factors of it, and how it is acquiring their needs, and how it's reproducing. Okay, so next is that the niche concept has gradually become linked to the phenomena of interspecific competition, and it's basically increasingly becoming identified with patterns of resource utilization, as I mentioned before. In general, niche relationships among members of competitive communities are usually modeled with this, as shown, the bell-shaped utilization curves. And this would be a resource gradient spectrum. And this would be a rate of resources. So this graph is showing this hypothetical 7 species. But the thing is that those towards the tails, so here, this part, A and G, are they have broader utilization curves because their resources renew more slowly. So in such an assemblage, the consumers are at equilibrium with their resource, and the rate of resources consumption is equal to the rate of renewable along the entire resource gradient. So that's the idea of adaptations to the conditions of the environment and acquiring all the requirements that a specific organism has. So that was the theoretical representation, and this is how it looks like in nature, in the practice. So specialized feeding niche on various bird species, shown here in a wetland, coastal wetland ecosystem. These specializations reduce the mentioned competition and allows sharing of limited resources. This is just an example of a food niche, but there are many other types of niches mentioned in the previous slide. But this is what we're talking about. So next to the one in savanna shown in the previous slide, the giraffe, this is a more linear one, but this representing of adaptations to the conditions of the environment in the name of acquiring most of the environment and excluding competitions the most you can. As I said, this is just the food niche representations, but there are, as mentioned, many other quoting dimensions of species niche, and this is something that is called n-dimensional hypervolume. And that's a concept of showing the complete range of conditions under which a certain organism can successfully replace itself. And that would be a holistic approach to niche philosophy. So besides the food niche we saw in a previous picture, there are many different dimensions of a niche of a specific organism. So depending on some levels on and dimensional shape of a niche, food reference is important one, and considering this one broad divisions on generalists and specialists is in a animal kingdom. So depending on the food niche, generalist species as raccoon here, they have broad niche and they can live in many different places. It's a variety of food and often tolerate a wide range of environmental conditions. So next to the food niche, they're generalists in many other dimensions of their niche. So their niche is basically widespread because they're widely tolerant, or so-called the generalist. And in contrast to generalists, there are specialists, as panda shown here. And the specialist species occupy narrow niches because they may be able to live in only one type of habitat and use only one or few types of food, or tolerate a narrow range of climate and other environmental conditions. So specialist species such as the giant panda shown here have a narrow niche, and generalist species have a broad niche, as a raccoon showed here. So we can say the raccoon is more adaptable and probably evolutionary more successful than the pandas, which are specialized for only a specific types of some dimensions of their niche. One very important and common phenomena, or maybe actually always present, but more on this later, in the story of niche, is a niche overlap. So here, and this occurs when two organismic units use the same resources or other environmental variables. So usually niches overlap only partially, with some resources being shared and others being used exclusively by each organic unit, but it doesn't have to be. To try to avoid this overlap, because this is something none of the organisms actually want, is to have a dynamic niche, to move towards the availability of resources you need. So realize niches of most organisms change both in time and from place to place as physical and biotic environments vary. So there are two options the niche dynamics is happening. It can be a short-term or a long-term basis. So on one hand, a short-term basis, for example an ecological timescale, is usually the life of a single individual or most a few generations. And the long term would be a over evolutionary time of many generations. So on one hand we have short term dynamics, and this is shown in butterfly, and it's particularly visible in insects because they have entirely disjunct, non-overlapping niches at different times of their life history. So as you can see, there are different stages of insects' life, and depending on the stage they have different needs for different resources in different time. So they are trying to reduce the niche overlap as much as they can, and it's all happening through life span of a single, this example butterfly, so a single individual. On the other hand, we have an example of a long-term dynamics, and this is what we mentioned is happening through the evolution, so through many different generations, one after the other. And this is an example of a tertiary. It's a nocturnal lemur. It's a primate with, as you can definitely see, huge eyes. Their eyes are bigger than the brain in general, each eye, and this is what happened through the evolution. So this is eye adaptation, which these animals had, so they can adapt to different niches. They became nocturnal animals, so they live and feed during the night, and this is a good way to escape from predators and to have wider options for food availability, feeding, because there are less animals living at night, especially primates, and most of their predators would sleep at that time. So they try to find their safest and most rewarding place in this whole ecosystem of wood they live in. So they adapted to the nightlife, and the eyes adaptations followed, so they can be physically prepared for the food and behavioral niche they quoting chosen by physiologically and anatomically adapting to it. Okay, that is it for today. Thank you for following me. See you in the next lecture.